Hi everybody, I'm Alex Orleans. I'm the Deputy Manager for Targeted Intrusion at Crowdstrike Intelligence Global Threat Analysis Cell, and this is the cell's director, Katie Blankenship. We're here to talk to you today about how Iran has started their own little war, adopting disruptive ransomware and information operations, which marks a new horizon in computer network attack operations.
All right, so since last summer, we have seen an increasing number of Iran-nexus groups and adversaries starting to use ransomware in their operations. Now, while these operations will use ransom notes and dedicated leak sites demanding hard cryptocurrency, we're really not seeing any viable effort at actual currency generation. What we are seeing are actors increasingly use ransomware's disruptive capability blended with information operations. And we call this a lock and leak model approach. So what we think Iran is doing here is that they're using these tactics to start their own lower form of cyber attack, which draws less visibility, it's less costly to perform, and it provides more room for deniability, all while allowing these actors to successfully fulfill their suspected motivations at the end of the day. So with that being said, we think that we are at a critical horizon of what computer network attack can evolve into in that medium term. So as I mentioned, we are seeing an increasing number of groups and actors use this tactic, but for today, we're going to highlight 4 primary actors and groups that we believe have been trendsetters along this path. So first up, we have a group that we track as Tarnished Gauntlet. Now, this group, back in the summer and fall of last year, they started to use a variant of the commodity ransomware known as Thanos. And a huge shout out to Palo Alto for publicly detailing this activity. Next up, we have in October of 2020, the Iran-nexus adversary Pioneer Kitten start to use their own custom ransomware called Pay2Key against operations targeting an Israeli target base. And huge shout out to Clear Sky as well for detailing this activity. So I'd like to highlight with the Pioneer Kitten activity as well. They have continued into 2021. However, they are switching those custom ransomware tooling that they're using and this year to include the use of Networm.
So if Pioneer Kitten pioneered the lock and leak model through their initial campaigns during 2020 and into 2021, Spectral Kitten, which was first got public attention through SentinelOne's coverage of Spectral Kitten's Apostle ransomware variant, certainly represents a savvier approach, much more aggressive use of personas, of cross-channel media engagement, of direct engagement with the press in order to leak and embarrass targets, again, across an Israeli target base. We've seen them adopt a different persona in 2021. They used a persona known as Dark Crypt for a very short period of time, but as recently as last month, they've reverted to the Black Shadow persona and again are engaging in very aggressive leak operations with faux e-crime ransom demand narratives accompanying them. And then separately from Pioneer and Spectral, we have an actor called Nemesis Kitten. Microsoft referred to these guys as Phosphorus earlier today. We tracked them as Nemesis Kitten. And they're really about inflicting disruptive impacts as opportunistically and as immediately on targets as they possibly can, specifically across North America and the Middle East. We've seen them use custom wipers. We've seen them use custom ransomware. We've seen them use BitLocker and Disruptive. They'll use whatever they have on hand. They've been active since about Q2 of this year, and they're still active right now. So we throw in the phrase lock and leak around a lot. And so we wanted to give you a hypothetical timeline of what this might look like with the idea of the dedicated leak site for such an actor being established on today at CYBERWARCON. They debuted their dedicated leak site, which you can see down there at the bottom on November 16th. This is hypothetical. It's very fan-dancy kind of a thing, but it's really 2 stages. You have an initial intrusion with a data exfil window. Right before the encryption date, they're compiling whatever tool they're going to be using for disruptive impacts. And then very shortly thereafter, they'll encrypt, begin initial messaging across things like Twitter or Telegram, very low key. Then they'll get the DLS up. They'll get a public one, usually in an onion one as well. And then the aggressive messaging will begin. There'll be a lot of public shaming. They'll leak conversations with targets. They'll say the targets aren't paying fast enough. They'll say, the pain is going to continue again and again and again. And that's where you get into the leak portion and really aggressiveness. And more recently, the press engagement, directly reaching out to the press to say so-and-so isn't paying, has become a much more prominent feature.
All right. So why are the Iranians adopting this model? Well, if we look at the arc of activity, we can really start to see a common theme of Iranians testing the water in the attack space to really see what they can get away with without drawing those high-profile responses like they saw with previous disruptive operations such as Shamoon. Additionally, the use of ransomware in operations by state nexus adversaries for non-currency generation purposes has been observed and has also been successful. So going back to our 4 examples, we'd like to go through what we've observed as far as motives in each of these and parallel them with other observations that we've seen by other state nexus adversaries. So the first motive we have is cover for action, the use of ransomware as cover for action or a distraction. So going back to that tarnished gauntlet activity that I talked about, when we saw Tarnished Gauntlet last summer, we saw them deploy that variant of Thanos in operations that dovetailed espionage operations by another Iranian adversary, Static Kitten. We believe that this was actually a cover for action then by Tarnished Gauntlet for Static Kitten. So this is an interesting motive that we see with ransomware, and we've seen it before, particularly by North Korean actors. I'd like to highlight a specific example by a group we track as Stardust Chalima. So back in 2017, 2018, Stardust Chalima used a variant of the commodity ransomware known as Hermes in their operations that were targeting the financial sector. So they used this variant as a cover for action for their cash out activity. The second motive that we've identified is the use of ransomware for harassment and embarrassment purposes. So going back to that Pioneer Kitten example, those initial operations we saw by Pioneer Kitten really embody an operation that was designed to annoy and harass their targets. There was no real viable effort at currency generation there. So to parallel that with another North Korean adversary, I want to highlight a group that we track as Velvet Chalima. Now, Velvet Chalima, back in December of 2014, they targeted the South Korean entity, the Korea Hydro and Nuclear Power Plant. And interestingly, in this operation, they ransomed the victim, they threatened them with leaks, and at the end of the day, the whole purpose of that was to really embarrass and harass that victim. And that's what we're seeing with those Pioneer Kitten operations.
So very similarly to how Pioneer Kitten, was an initial actor that we observed engaging in lock and leak, and then we saw Spectral Kitten engage in a more refined version of that. The savvier way that it has engaged in those operations, that Spectral Kitten has engaged in leaks and use of personas, seems to also be a maturation of objective as well. While we haven't been able to link Pioneer to Spectral, it does appear that one is learning from the model of the other, in that the goals of Spectral Kitten operations seem much more aligned with achieving psychological or influence operations impacts, which was a point first mentioned publicly on Mandiant's Ion Security podcast. Spectral seems very intent in its targeting of Israeli entities, including recently, across the tech sector, really to trying to undermine a sense of faith and stability in the security of Israeli networks and the ability of the Israeli government and of network defenders to secure those networks. We see a parallel here with Voodoo Bear, also known as sandworm activity, between 2016 and 2017 that targeted multiple entities in the Ukrainian financial sector with a variety of destructive and disruptive attacks. These included Killdisk, Xdata, Bad Rabbit, the latter of 2 of them being disruptive ransomware variants. And so we're seeing that kind of psychological operational parallel. Now, degradation is an ancillary impact to any of these other 3. Chris Krebs mentioned degradation earlier today. The folks from Meta alluded to a version of degradation earlier. And what degradation is, it's the psychological stress, the wearing down, the impact to operations, the having to recover. It's all of that drag that you get. It's the friction in Clausewitz's terms that you have to deal with from responding to an intrusion, particularly one that is disruptive, and even more so the one that is amplified through an information operation. And that impact can ripple up and out from the network that has to be defended and responded to all the way up through things like the press, which again, with Spectral Kitten's engagement, especially of the Israeli media, you see an effort to do that. And there's a big parallel here, again, alluding to the activity that Chris talked to during his keynote, the FSB-related activity, which we track as Berserk Bear. The sort of wide aperture targeting of a wide variety of US government, state, local, and tribal entities in 2020 leading up to the 2020 election. This activity was very shallow, didn't really have any impact, but it got near enough to some things to maybe make some people nervous or worried, and that was kind of, we think, related to that, generating that degradation impact.
All right, so what can we expect on the horizon for this type of activity? Well, first and foremost, we do not believe that this activity is going to pivot into large-scale, real viable currency generation operations. Such a move would severely jeopardize Iran's ability to participate in the global energy markets, and they don't want that. But what the lock and leak model does tell us is that the future of disruptive operations, they're moving from the hacktivist persona into the e-crime personas. And this is really because those e-crime personas can organically capitalize on ransomware's disruptive capabilities while also allowing actors to blend in with a large volume of e-crime activity.
So just like that e-crime activity they're trying to blend in with, this very model of CNA operations is less discriminate, more opportunistic, and more widely target scoped. So in that sense, you have more pervasive risk. And what that pervasive risk amounts to is more and more entities are potentially the targets of state-nexus CNA operations than ever before, now that ransomware has been fully operationalized as a CNA tool, as it has been with Iran. Now, we've thrown a lot of information at you guys today very quickly. We wanted for the threat hunters and for the people playing along at home to throw up some hashes related to the 4 actors that are associated here. You know, shout out to Clear Sky and Palo Alto for some of their coverage here that helped us put together this slide. And also to note that Checkpoint just put out a great blog on an actor known as Moses Staff that is also engaging in very similar operations. Thank you very much.
Great. Thanks, everybody.